Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Mademoiselle Lina, and you can find me online at www.conjureknits.com. Today, we are here to continue our adventure with Richard and Kaylin in The Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind. If you have missed any of the previous episodes of this book, you may go to the playlist entitled Virtual Book Club and view them all from the beginning there. Before we get started, I would like to say thank you for viewing my video. And if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to my channel. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and click on the little bell so that you'll receive notifications of when I go live or upload new videos. I do try to stay pretty busy here on my channel. I do all 12 zodiac signs for the monthly tarot scopes. On Sundays, we have Conjure Crew with myself, Mambo Tanya, and the Black Bonnet Witch. On Mondays, I upload the weekly forecast. Every day, I do a card of the day reveal. On Wednesdays, we have the Virtual Book Club. We are currently reading the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. It has been so much fun following Richard and Kaylin on their adventures, so you are definitely going to want to join us for that. I also pop on from time to time and do free readings, so make sure you get my notifications by clicking that little bell. All right, I feel that I have rambled on long enough. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
Chapter 18. The trail was wide enough to allow Richard and Kaylin to walk side by side after they left Addie's place. Clouds hung thick and threatening, but the rain held off. Both wrapped their cloaks tight. Damp brown pine needles matted the path through the forest. There was little brush among the big trees, allowing an open view for a good distance. Ferns covered the ground in feathery swaths through the trees, and dead wood lay in it here and there as if asleep in a bed. Squirrels scolded the two of them as they hiked along, while birds sang with monotonous conviction. Richard picked at the branch of a small balsam fir as they walked past, stripping the needles between his thumb and the crook of his first finger. "Addie is more than she seems," he said at last. Kaylin looked up at him as they walked. "She is a sorceress." Richard glanced sideways at her in surprise. "Really? I don't know exactly what a sorceress is." "Well, she is more than us, but less than a wizard." Richard smelled the aromatic fragrance of the balsam needles, then cast them aside. Maybe she was more than he, Richard thought, but he wasn't at all sure she was more than Kaylin. He remembered the look on Addie's face when Kaylin had grabbed her by the wrist. It had been a look of fear. He remembered the look on Zed's face when he had first seen her. What power did she have that could frighten a sorceress and a wizard? What had she done that had caused thunder without sound? She had done it twice that he knew of, once with the quad and once with Shar, the night wisp. Richard remembered the pain that had followed. A sorceress greater than Kaylin? He wondered. "What's Addie doing living here in the pass?" Kaylin pushed some of her hair back over her shoulder. "She became tired of people coming to her all the time, wanting spells and potions. She wanted to be left alone to study whatever it is a sorceress studies. Some sort of higher summons, as she called it. Do you think she will be safe when the boundary fails?" "I hope so. I like her." "Me too," he added with a smile. The trail, climbing sharply in places, forced them to go single file at times as it twisted along steep, rocky hillsides and over ridges. Richard let Kaylin go first, so he could keep an eye on her, make sure she didn't wander off the path. At times, he had to point out the trail, his experience as a guide making it plain to him, but not to her unpracticed eye. Other times, the trail was a well-defined rut. The woods were thick. Trees grew from splits in the rock that pushed up above the leaf litter. Mist drifted among the trees. Roots bulging from cracks provided handholds as they climbed the abrupt inclines. His legs ached from the effort of descending extreme drops in the dark trail. Richard wondered what they were going to do once they reached the Midlands. He had depended on Zed to let him know the plan once they crossed the pass, and now they were without Zed, without a plan. He felt kind of foolish to be charging into the Midlands. What was he going to do once they crossed over? Stand there and look around, divine where the box was, and then be off after it? Didn't sound like a good plan to him. They didn't have time to wander about aimlessly, hoping they would come across something. No one was going to be waiting for him, waiting to tell him where to go next. They reached a steep jumble of rock. The trail went straight up the face. Richard surveyed the terrain. It would be easier to go around rather than climb over the jut of rock, but he finally decided against it, the thought that the boundary could be anywhere making up his mind. There must be a reason the trail went this way. He went first and took Kalen's hand, helping to pull her up. As he walked, Richard's thoughts continued nagging at him. Someone had hidden one of the boxes, or Rawl would have it already. If Rawl couldn't find it, how was Richard to? He didn't know anyone in the Midlands. He didn't know where to look. But someone knew where the last box was, and that was how they had to find it. They couldn't look for the box. They had to look for someone who would be able to tell them where it was. Magic, he thought suddenly. The Midlands was a land of magic. Maybe someone with magic could tell where the box was. They had to look for someone with the right kind of magic. Addie could tell things about him without ever having seen him before. There had to be someone with the kind of magic that could tell him where the box was without ever having seen it. Then, of course, they had to convince that person to tell them. But maybe if someone was hiding their knowledge from Dark and Rawl, he would be glad to help stop him. It seemed there were too many wishes and hopes in his thoughts. But there was one thing he did know. Even if Rawl got all the boxes, without the book he wasn't going to know which box was which. As they walked along, Richard recited the Book of Counted Shadows to himself, trying to find a way to stop Rawl. Since it was an instruction book for the boxes, it should have a way to stop their use. But there was nothing like that in the book. The actual explanation of what each box would do, directives to determine which box was which, and how to open one, took up only a relatively small portion at the end of the book. Richard understood this part well, as it was clear and precise. Most of the book, though, was taken up with directions for countering unforeseen eventualities, resolving problems that could prevent the holder of the boxes from succeeding. The book even started out with how to verify the truth of the instructions. If he could create one of these problems, he could stop Rawl, since Rawl didn't have the book to help him. But most of the problems were things he had no way of bringing about. Problems with sun angles and clouds on the day of opening. And a lot of it made no sense to him. It spoke of things he had never heard of. Richard told himself to stop thinking of the problem and to think of the solution. He would go through the book again, cleared his mind, and started at the beginning. Verification of the truth of the words of the Book of Counted Shadows, if spoken by another, rather than read by the one who commands the boxes, can only be ensured by the use of a confessor. By late afternoon, Richard and Kalen were sweating freely with the effort of the hike. As they crossed a small stream, Kalen stopped and dipped a cloth in the water and used it to wipe her face. Richard thought it was a good idea. When they came to the next stream, he stopped to do the same. Clear water was shallow as it ran over a bed of round stones. He balanced on a flat rock as he squatted to soak a cloth in the cold water. When he stood up, Richard saw the shadow thing. He froze instantly. Off through the woods, there was something standing partly behind a tree trunk. It wasn't a person, but was about that size, with no definite shape. It looked like a person's shadow standing up in the air. The shadow thing didn't move. Richard blinked and squinted his eyes, trying to tell if he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. Maybe it was just a trick of the dim afternoon light. the shadow of a tree he mistook for something more. Kaelin had continued to walk along the trail. Richard came quickly up behind her and put his hand on the small of her back, below her pack, so she wouldn't stop. He leaned over her shoulder and whispered in her ear, "Look to the left, off through the trees. Tell me what you see." He kept his hand on her back, kept her walking along as she turned her head, looking off to the trees. Her eyes searched as she held her hair back, out of the way. Then she saw the thing. "What is it?" she whispered, looking back to his face. He was a little surprised. "I don't know. I thought maybe you could tell me." She shook her head. The shadow remained motionless. Maybe it was nothing, a trick of the light, he tried to tell himself. He knew that wasn't true. "Maybe it's one of the beasts Addie told us about, and it can't see us," he offered. She gave him a sidelong glance. Beasts have bones. Kaelin was right, of course, but he had been hoping she would have agreed with the idea. As they moved quickly down the trail, the shadow thing stayed where it was, and they were soon out of sight of it. Richard breathed easier. It appeared that the bone necklace Kaelin wore and his tooth had hidden them. They ate a supper of bread, carrots, and smoked meat as they walked. Neither enjoyed the meal. Their eyes searched off into the deep woods as they ate. Even though it hadn't rained all day, everything was still wet, and occasionally water dripped from the trees. The rock was slick with slime in places, needing care to be crossed safely. Both watched the surrounding forest for any sign of danger. They saw nothing. The fact that they saw nothing began to worry Richard. There were no squirrels, no chipmunks, no birds, no animals of any kind. It was too quiet. Daylight was slipping away. Soon they would be at the Narrows. He worried about that, too. The idea of seeing the things from the boundary again was frightening. The idea of seeing his father again was terrifying. His insides cringed at what Addie had told them, that those in the boundary would call to them. He remembered how seductive their calls were. He had to be prepared to resist. He had to harden himself against it. Kaelin had almost been pulled back into the underworld when they were in the Wayward Pine, the first night he knew her. When they were with Zed and Chase, something had tried to pull her in again. He was troubled that the bone might not protect her when they were that close. The trail leveled out and widened, allowing them to walk side by side again. He was tired from the day's hike, and it would be another night and day before they could rest. Crossing the Narrows in the dark and when they were exhausted sounded like a bad idea, but Addie had been insistent they not stop. He could not question a person who knew the pass as well as she. He knew the story of the Gripper would keep him wide awake. Kaelin looked around at the woods, turned to check behind. She stopped suddenly, grabbing his arm. In the trail, not 10 yards behind, stood a shadow. Like the other, this one did not move. He could see through it, see the woods behind, as if it were made of smoke. Kaelin kept a firm grip on his arm as both of them walked ahead in a sideways fashion, watching the shadow thing. They rounded a turn in the trail and were away from it. They walked on faster. "Kaelin, do you remember when you told me of the shadow people that Pani Saral sent forth? Could those be shadow people?" She gave him a worried look. "I don't know. I've never seen one. They were in the last war before I was born. But the stories were always told the same, that they floated along. I never heard anyone say they stood still like that. Maybe it's because of the bones. Maybe they know we're here but can't find us, so they stay still to search." She wrapped her cloak tighter, obviously afraid of his idea, but didn't say anything. In the gathering night they walked along, close to each other, sharing the same troubling thoughts. Another shadow stood at the side of the trail. Kaelin gripped his arm tight. They passed slowly, quietly, keeping their eyes on it. It didn't move. Richard felt like panicking, but knew he couldn't. They had to stay on the trail, had to use their heads. Maybe the shadows were trying to make them bolt, to run from the trail and cross over accidentally into the underworld. They looked around behind as they went. When Kaelin was looking the other way, a branch brushed her face. She jumped against him with a start. She looked over and apologized. Richard gave her a reassuring smile. Pine needles held droplets from the rains and mist, and when a light breeze swayed the branches, water from the trees above rained down. In the near darkness, they had a hard time telling if there were shadow things around them or if it was just the dark shapes of tree trunks. Twice they had no trouble telling. They were close to the trail, and there was no doubt what they were. Still, the shadows did not follow or move, but stood as if watching, even though they had no eyes. "What are we going to do if they come for us?" Kaelin asked in a tense voice. Her grip on his arm was becoming painful, so he pried her fingers off and put her hand in his. She gave his hand a squeeze. "Sorry," she said with a self-conscious smile. "If they come for us, the sword will stop them," he answered confidently. "What makes you so sure?" "It stopped the things in the boundary." She seemed satisfied with the answer. He wished he were. The forest was dead quiet, except for a soft rasp he couldn't quite figure out. There were none of the usual night sounds. Dark branches swayed near them with a breeze, making his heart race. "Richard," Kaelin said quietly, "don't let them touch you. If they are shadow people, their touch is death. Even if they are not shadow people, we don't know what would happen. We must not let them touch us." He gave her hand a squeeze of reassurance. Richard resisted the temptation to pull the sword. There might be too many for the sword, if the sword's magic even worked against shadows. If there was no other choice, he would use the sword. But for now, his instincts told him not to. The woods were getting darker. Tree trunks stood like black pillars in the murk. Richard felt as if there were eyes everywhere, watching. The trail was beginning to traverse a hillside, and he could see dark rocks rising up to their left. Runoff from the rains trickled through the rock. He could hear it bubbling and dripping and splashing. The ground dropped away on the right. The next time they looked back, there were 3 shadows barely visible in the path behind. The 2 of them kept moving. Richard heard the soft scraping sound again, off in the woods to either side. It wasn't a sound he was familiar with. He could feel, more than see, that there were shadow things on each side and behind them. A few were close enough to the trail that there was no doubt what they were. The only way that was clear was ahead. "Richard," Kaelin whispered, "do you think you should take out the night stone? I can hardly see the path." She was gripping his hand tightly. Richard hesitated. "I don't want to until we absolutely need it. I'm afraid of what might happen." "What do you mean?" "Well, those shadows haven't come for us yet. Maybe because they can't see us, because of the bones." He paused a moment. "But what if they can see the light from the nightstone?" Kaelin bit her bottom lip in worry. They strained to pick out the trail as it twisted to go around trees and boulders, over rocks and roots, cutting its way across the hillside. The soft scraping sound was nearer, all around. It sounded like claws on rock, he thought. 2 shadows stood ahead, close, the trail between them. Kaelin pressed tight against him and held her breath as they squeezed past. She buried her face against his shoulder when they were even with the shadow things. Richard put his arm around her, holding her tight. He knew how she felt. He was terrified too. His heart pounded. It seemed they were going too far with each step, getting in too deep. He looked behind, but in the darkness there was not enough light to see if the shadows were standing on the trail. Abruptly, an inky black shape loomed up before them. It was an enormous boulder, split down the middle. The Narrows. They pressed their backs up against the boulder, at the split. It was too dark to see the trail anymore, or if there were any shadow things close. They couldn't follow the trail through the Narrows without the light of the Nightstone. It was far too dangerous. One wrong step in the Narrows and they were dead. In the stillness, the scraping sound was closer, and all around them. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring, dumped the Nightstone into his palm. Warm light flared into the night, lighting the woods around, casting eerie shadows. He held the stone out to see better. Kaelin gasped. In the warm, yellowish illumination, they could see a wall of the shadow things, hundreds of them, not an inch between any two. They formed a half circle less than 20 feet away. On the ground were dozens and dozens of hump-shaped creatures, almost looking like rocks at first. But they weren't rocks. Gray armor bands interlocked across their backs, jagged spikes poked out around the bottom edge. Grippers. That was what the sound was. Their claws on the rocks. The grippers were moving with an odd, waddling gait, their humped bodies swaying from side to side as they struggled forward. Not fast, but steady. Some were only a few feet away. For the first time, the shadows began to move, floating, drifting, tightening their ring. Kaelin stood frozen, her back against the boulder, her eyes wide. Richard reached across the split, grabbed a fistful of her shirt, and pulled her into the opening. The walls were wet and slick. The tightness of the space made him feel as if his heart were coming up in his throat. He didn't like tight places. They backed through, turning occasionally to check their way. He held the Nightstone out, lighting the shadow things as they came. Grippers crawled into the split. Richard could hear the sound of Kaelin's rapid breathing echoing in the confining, dank space. They continued backing up, their shoulders sliding against the sides of the rock. Cold, slimy water soaked their shirts. In one spot, they had to duck down and turn sideways because the crack narrowed, almost closing together, open just enough for them to pass down low. Forest debris fallen into the split lay in the dampness, decomposing. The place smelled of sickening rot. They continued moving sideways and at last reached the other side. The shadows stopped when they reached the opening in the rock. The grippers didn't. Richard kicked one that got too close, sending it tumbling through the leaves and sticks on the floor of the split. Landing on its back, it clawed at the air, snapping and hissing, twisting and rocking, until it righted itself. When it did, the gripper rose up on its claw-tipped feet and let out a clicking growl before coming on once again. Both turned quickly to follow the path. Richard held the Nightstone out to light the Narrows trail. Kaelin drew a sharp breath. The warm light illuminated the hillside where the Narrows path should have been. Spread out before them, as far as they could see, was a mass of rubble. Rocks, tree limbs, splintered wood, and mud all tumbled together. A slide had recently plunged down the hillside. The Narrows trail had been swept away. They took a step beyond the rock to have a better look. Green light of boundary came on, surprising them. They stepped back as one. Richard. Kaelin clutched his arm. The grippers were at their heels. The shadows floated in the split. Chapter 19. Torches set in ornate gold brackets lit the walls of the crypt with flickering light, reflected off the polished pink granite of the huge vaulted room, lending their smell of pitch to the fragrance of roses in the dead, still air. White roses, replaced every morning without fail for the last 3 decades, filled each of the 57 gold vases set in the wall beneath each of the 57 torches that represented each year in the life of the deceased. The floor was white marble, so that any white rose petal that fell would not be a distraction before it could be whisked away. A large staff saw to it that no torch was allowed to go spent for longer than a few moments, that rose petals were not allowed to rest long upon the floor. The staff was attentive and devoted to their tasks. Failure to be so resulted in an immediate beheading. Guards watched the tomb day and night to be sure the torches burned, the flowers were fresh, and no rose petals sat too long on the floor. And, of course, to carry out executions. Staff positions were filled from the surrounding Daharan countryside. Being a member of the crypt staff was an honor by law. The honor brought with it the promise of a quick death if an execution was in order. A slow death in Dahara was greatly feared and common. New recruits, for fear they would speak ill of the dead king while in the crypt, had their tongues cut out. The master, on the evenings when he was at home in the people's palace, would visit the tomb. No staff or tomb guards were allowed to be present during these visits. The staff had spent a busy afternoon replacing the torches with freshly burning ones, and tested each of the hundreds of white roses by gently shaking them to make sure none of the petals were loose. Since any torch going out during the royal visit, or any rose petal falling to the floor, would result in an execution. A short pillar in the center of the immense room supported the coffin itself, giving it the effect of floating in the air. The gold-enshrouded coffin glowed in the torchlight. Carved symbols covered its sides and continued in a ring around the room, cut into the granite beneath the torches and gold vases. Instructions in an ancient language from a father to a son on the process of going to the underworld and returning. Instructions in an ancient language understood by only a handful other than the son. None but the son lived in Dahara. All the others in Dahara who understood had long ago been put to death. Someday, the rest would be. The crypt staff and guards had been sent away. The master was visiting his father's tomb. 2 of his personal guards stood watch over him, one to each side of the massive, elaborately carved and polished door. Their sleeveless leather and mail uniforms helped display their bulky forms, the sharp contours of their heavy muscles, and the bands they wore around their arms just above their elbows, bands with raised projections sharpened to deadly edges, used in close combat to tear apart an adversary. Darkenrahl ran his delicate fingers over the carved symbols on his father's tomb. An immaculate white robe, its only decoration gold embroidery in a narrow band around the neck and down the front, covered his lean frame to within an inch of the floor. He wore no jewelry other than a curved knife in a gold scabbard embossed with symbols warning the spirits to give way. The belt that held it was woven of gold wire. Fine, straight, blonde hair hung almost to his shoulders. His eyes were a painfully handsome shade of blue. His features set off his eyes perfectly. Many women had been taken to his bed. Because of his striking looks and his power, some went eagerly. The others went despite his looks, but because of his power. Whether or not they were eager did not concern him. Were they unwise enough to be repulsed when they saw the scars, they entertained him in ways they could not have foreseen. Darkenrahl, as had his father before him, considered women merely vessels for the man's seed, the dirt it grew in, unworthy of higher recognition. Darkenrahl, as his father before him, would have no wife. His own mother had been nothing more than the first to sprout his father's wondrous seed, and then she had been discarded, as was only fitting. If he had siblings, he didn't know, nor did it matter. He was firstborn. All glory fell to him. He was the one born with the gift, and the one to whom his father passed the knowledge. If he had half-brothers or sisters, they were merely weeds to be expunged if discovered. Darkenrahl spoke the words silently in his mind as his fingers traced the symbols. Although it was of the utmost importance that the directives were followed exactly, he had no fear of making an error. The instructions were burned into his memory, but he enjoyed reliving the thrill of the passage, of hanging between life and death. He savored going into the underworld, commanding the dead. He was impatient for the next journey. Footsteps echoed at someone's approach. Dark and Rawl showed no concern or interest, but his guards did. They drew their swords. No one was allowed to come into the crypt with the master. When they saw who it was, they stood down, replacing their weapons. No one but Demon Nass, that is. Demon Nass, the right hand of Rawl, the lightning of the master's dark thoughts, was a man as big as those he commanded. As he strode in, ignoring the guards, his sharply chiseled muscles stood out in stark relief in the torchlight. His chest was covered with skin as smooth as that of the young boys he had a weakness for. In stark contrast, his face was riddled with pockmarks. His blonde hair was cropped close enough to cause it to stand up in a collection of spikes. A streak of black hair started in the middle of his right eyebrow and continued back over his head to the right of center. It made him recognizable from a distance, a fact appreciated by those who had cause to know of him. Dark and Rawl stood absorbed in the reading of the symbols, and did not look when his guards drew their weapons or when they replaced them. Although his guards were formidable, they were unnecessary, mere accoutrements of his position. He had powers enough to put down any threat. Demon Nass stood at ease, waiting for the master to finish. When at last Dark and Rawl turned, his blonde hair and stark white robe swished around with him. Demon gave a respectful bow of his head. Lord Rawl. His voice was deep, coarse. He kept his head bowed. Demon, my old friend, how good to see you again. Rawl's quiet tone had a clear, almost liquid quality to it. Demon straightened, his face set in a frown of displeasure. Lord Rawl, Queen Melina has delivered her list of demands. Dark and Rawl stared through the commander, as if he weren't there, slowly wetting the tips of the first 3 fingers of his right hand with his tongue, and then carefully stroking his lips and eyebrows with them. Have you brought me a boy? Rawl asked expectantly. Yes, Lord Rawl. He awaits you in the Garden of Life. Good. A small smile spread across Dark and Rawl's handsome face. Good. And he is not too old. He is still a boy. Yes, Lord Rawl, he is but a boy. Demon looked away from Rawl's blue eyes. Dark and Rawl's smile widened. You are sure, Demon? Did you take off his pants yourself and check? Demon shifted his weight. Yes, Lord Rawl. Rawl's eyes searched the other's face. You didn't touch him, did you? His smile vanished. He must be unsoiled. No, Lord Rawl, Demon insisted, looking back to the master, his eyes wide. I would not touch your spirit guide. You have forbidden it. Dark and Rawl again wet his fingers and smoothed his eyebrows as he took a step closer. I know you wanted to, Demon. Was it hard for you? Looking but not touching. His smile came back, teasing, then melted again. Your weakness has caused me trouble before. I took care of that, Demon protested in his deep voice, but not too forcefully. I had that traitor Brophy arrested for the murder of that boy. Yes, Rawl snapped back, and then he submitted to a confessor to prove his innocence. Demon's face wrinkled in frustration. How was I to know he would do that? Who could expect a man would willingly do that? Rawl held up his hand. Demon fell silent. You should have been more careful. You should have taken the confessors into account. And is that job finished yet? All but one, Demon admitted. The quad that went after Kalen, the mother confessor, failed. I had to send another. Dark and Rawl frowned. Confessor Kalen is the one who took the confession of this traitor Brophy and found him innocent, is she not? Demon nodded slowly, his face contorted in anger. She must have found help, or the quad would not have failed. Rawl remained silent, watching the other. At last, Demon broke the silence. It is but a small matter, Lord Rawl, not worthy of your time or thought. Darken Rawl lifted an eyebrow. I will decide what matters are worthy of my attention. His voice was soft, almost kind. Of course, Lord Rawl, please forgive me. Demon didn't need to hear an angry tone to know he was treading on dangerous ground. Rawl licked his fingers again and rubbed them on his lips. He looked sharply back up into the other's eyes. Demon, if you touch the boy, I will know. A bead of sweat rolled into Demon's eye. He tried to blink it away. Lord Rawl, he said in a coarse whisper, I would gladly give my life for you. I would not touch your spirit guide, I swear. Darken Rawl considered Demon Nass for a moment, then nodded. As I said, I would know anyway. And you know what I would do to you if you ever lied to me. I can't tolerate anyone lying to me. It's wrong. Lord Rawl, Demon said, anxious to change the subject. What of Queen Melina's demands? Rawl shrugged. Tell her I agree to all her demands in return for the box. Demon stared incredulously. But Lord Rawl, you have not seen them listed. Rawl shrugged innocently. Now they are truly a matter not worthy of my time or thought. Demon shifted his weight again, making the leather he wore creak. Lord Rawl, I do not understand why you play this game with the Queen. It is humiliating to be issued a list of demands. With no trouble, we could crush her like the fat toad she is. Just give me the word. Allow me to issue my own demands on your behalf. She will be made to regret not bowing down to you as she should have. Rawl smiled a small private smile as he studied the pockmarked face of his loyal commander. She has a wizard, Demon, he whispered, his blue eyes intense. I know. Demon's fists tightened. Giller, you have only to ask, Lord Rawl, and I will bring you his head. Demon, why do you think Queen Melina would enlist a wizard in her service? Demon only shrugged. So Rawl answered his own question. To protect the box, that is why. It is her protection, too, she believes. If we kill her, or the wizard, we may find he has hidden the box with magic, and then we would have to spend time finding it. So why move too quickly? For now, the easiest path is to go along with her. If she gives me any trouble, I will deal with her. And the wizard. He walked slowly around his father's coffin, trailing his fingers along the carved symbols as he kept his blue eyes on Demon. And anyway, once I have the last box, her demands will be meaningless. He came back to the big man, stopping in front of him. But there is another reason, my friend. Demon cocked his head to the side. Another reason? Darken Rawl nodded, leaned closer, and lowered his voice. Demon, do you kill your little boyfriends before or after? Demon leaned back a little, away from the other, hooking a thumb in his belt. He cleared his throat. At last he answered, After. And why after? Why not before? Rawl asked, his face in a coy, questioning frown. Demon avoided the master's eyes, looked down at the floor, and shifted his weight to his other foot. Darken Rawl continued to keep his face close, watching, waiting. In a voice too low for the guards to hear, Demon spoke. I like it when they squirm. A slow smile spread over Rawl's face. That is the other reason, my friend. I too enjoy it when they squirm, so to speak. I want to enjoy watching her squirm before I kill her. He licked the ends of his fingers again and stroked them on his lips. A knowing grin grew across the pockmarked face. I will tell Queen Melina that Father Rawl has graciously agreed to her terms. Darkenrawl put his hand on Demon's muscled shoulder. Very good, my friend. Now, show me what manner of boy you have brought me. Both wearing smiles, they strode toward the door. Before they reached it, Darkenrawl stopped suddenly. He spun on his heels, his robes flinging around him. What was that sound? He demanded. Except for the hiss of the torches, the crypt was as silent as the dead king. Demon and the guards looked slowly around the chamber. There! Rawl thrust out his arm. The other three looked where he pointed. A single white rose petal sat on the floor. Darkenrawl's face reddened, his eyes fierce. Shaking, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. His eyes filled with tears of wrath. He was too furious to speak. Regaining his composure, he held out his hand toward where the white petal lay on the cold marble floor. As if touched by a breeze, it rose into the air and floated across the room, settling in Rawl's outstretched hand. He licked the petal, turned to one of the guards, and stuck it to the man's forehead. The heavily muscled guard looked back impassively. He knew what the master wanted, and gave a single grim nod before turning and going through the door in one fluid motion, pulling his sword as he went. Darkenrawl straightened his body, smoothed his hair and then his robes with the flats of his hands. He took a deep breath, letting his anger out with it. Frowning, his blue eyes searched up at Demon, who stood calmly beside him. I ask nothing else of them, only that they care for my father's tomb. Their needs are seen to, they are fed and clothed and taken care of. It is a simple request. His face took on a hurt look. Why do they mock me with their carelessness? He looked over to his father's coffin, then back to the other's face. Do you think I am too harsh with them, Demon? The commander's hard eyes scowled back. Not harsh enough. If you were not so compassionate, if you didn't allow them a quick punishment, maybe the others would learn to treat your heartfelt requests with more commitment. I would not be as lenient. Darkenrawl stared off at nothing in particular and nodded absently. After a time, he took another deep breath and strode through the door, with Demon at his side and the remaining guard following at a respectful distance. They went down long corridors of polished granite lit by torches, up spiral stairs of white stone, down more corridors with windows that let the light out into the darkness. The stone smelled damp, stale. Several levels up, the air regained its freshness. Small tables of lustrous wood stationed at intervals along the halls held vases with bouquets of fresh flowers that lent a light fragrance to the rooms. As they came to a pair of doors with a scene of hillsides and forests carved in relief, the second guard rejoined them, the task assigned him completed. Demon pulled on the iron rings, and the heavy doors opened smoothly, silently. Beyond was a room of dark brown oak panels. It gleamed in the light of the candles and lamps set about on heavy tables. Books lined two walls, and an immense fireplace warmed the two-story room. Rawl stopped for a short time to consult an old leather-bound book sitting on a pedestal. Then he and his commander walked on through a labyrinth of rooms, most covered in the same warm wood panels. A few were plastered and painted with scenes of the Dahara countryside, forests and fields, game and children. The guards followed at a distance, watching everywhere, alert but silent. The master's shadows. Logs crackled and popped as flames wavered in a brick hearth, providing the only light in one of the smaller rooms they passed into. On the walls hung trophies of the hunt, heads of every sort of beast. Antlers jutted out, lit by the light of the flames. Darken Rawl stopped suddenly in mid-stride, his robes made pink in the firelight. "Again," he whispered. Demon had stopped when Rawl did, and now watched him with questioning eyes. Again she comes to the boundary, to the underworld. He licked his fingertips, smoothing them carefully over his lips and eyebrows as his eyes fixed in a stare. "Who?" Demon asked. "The Mother Confessor, Kaelin. She has the help of a wizard, you know." "Giller is with the Queen," Demon insisted, "not with the Mother Confessor." A thin smile spread on Darken Rawl's lips. "Not Giller," he whispered. "The Old One. The one I seek. The one who killed my father. She has found him." Demon stood straight in surprise. Rawl turned and walked over to the window at the end of the room. Made up of small panes and round at the top, it stood twice his height. Firelight glinted off the curved knife at his belt. Clasping his hands behind him, he stood gazing down on the darkened countryside, on the night, on the things others couldn't see. He turned back to Demon, his blonde hair brushing his shoulders. "That is why she went to Westland, you know. Not to run from the Quad, as you thought, but to find the Great Wizard." His blue eyes sparkled. "She has done me a great favor, my friend. She has flushed out the wizard. It is fortunate she slipped past the ones in the underworld. Fate is truly on our side. You see, Demon, why I tell you not to worry so? It is my destiny to succeed. All things have a way of working toward my ends." Demon's brow knitted into a frown. "Just because one quad failed, that does not mean she has found the wizard. Quads have failed before." Rawl slowly licked his fingertips. He stepped closer to the big man. "The Old One has named a seeker," he whispered. Demon unclasped his hands in surprise. "Are you sure?" Rawl nodded. "The old wizard vowed never to help them again. No one has seen him in many years. No one has been able to offer his name, even to save their own lives. Now the Confessor crosses into Westland, the Quad vanishes, and a seeker is named." He smiled to himself. She must have touched him to make him help. Imagine his surprise when he saw her. Rawl's smile faded. He clenched his fists. "I almost had them. Almost had all three. But I was distracted by other matters, and they slipped away. For the time being." He considered this silently for a moment, then announced, "The second quad will fail too, you know. They will not be expecting to encounter a wizard." "Then I will send a third quad, and I will tell them of the wizard," Demon promised. "No." Rawl licked his fingertips, thinking, "Not yet. For now, let's wait and see what happens. Maybe she is meant to help me again." He considered this a moment. "Is she attractive, the Mother Confessor?" Demon scowled. "I have never seen her, but some of my men have. They fought over who would be named to the quads, who would have her." "Don't send another quad for now," Darken Rawl smiled. "It is time I had an heir." He nodded absently. "I will have her for myself," he declared. "If she tries to go through the boundary, she will be lost," Demon cautioned. Rawl shrugged. Maybe she will be smarter than that. She has already shown herself to be clever. Either way, I will have her. He glanced over at Demon. Either way, she will squirm for me. The two of them are dangerous, the wizard and the mother confessor. They could cause us trouble. Confessors subvert the word of Rawl. They are an annoyance. I think we should do as you first planned. We should kill her. Rawl gave a wave of his hand. You worry too much, Demon. As you said, confessors are an annoyance, nothing more. I will kill her myself if she proves troublesome, but after she bears me a son. A confessor son. The wizard cannot harm me as he did my father. I will see him squirm, and then I will kill him. Slowly. And the Seeker? Demon's face was hard with apprehension. Rawl shrugged. Even less than an annoyance. Lord Rawl, I need not remind you winter approaches. The master lifted an eyebrow, the firelight flickering in his eyes. The Queen has the last box. I will have it soon enough. There is no need for concern. Demon leaned his grim face closer. And the book? Rawl took a deep breath. After I have traveled to the underworld, I will search out the cipher boy again. Worry yourself of it no more, my friend. Fate is on our side. He turned and walked off. Demon followed, the guards slipping through the shadows behind. The Garden of Life was a cavernous room in the center of the people's palace. Leaded windows high overhead let in light for the lush plants. This night they let in the moonlight. Around the outside of the room were flowers set in beds, with walkways winding through. Beyond the flowers were small trees, short stone walls with vines covering them, and well-tended plants completing the landscaping. Except for the windows overhead, it mimicked an outdoor garden, a place of beauty, a place of peace. In the center of the expansive room was an area of lawn that swept around almost into a circle, the grass ring broken by a wedge of white stone, upon which sat a slab of granite, smooth but for grooves carved near the edge of the top, leading to a small well in one corner. It was held up by two short fluted pedestals. Beyond the slab stood a polished stone block set next to a fire pit. The block held an ancient iron bowl covered with beasts which served as legs to support the round bottom. The iron lid in the same half-sphere shape had but one beast upon it, a Shinga, an underworld creature, reared up on its two hind legs, serving as a handle. In the center of the lawn lay a round area of white sorcerer's sand, ringed with torches that burned with fluid flames, geometric symbols crisscrossed in the white sand. In the center of the sand was the boy, buried in an upright position to his neck. Dark and Rawl approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Demon waited off by the trees before the grass. The master stopped at the border of the grass and white sand, looking down at the boy. Dark and Rawl smiled. What is your name, my son? The boy's lower lip quivered as he looked up at Rawl. His eyes shifted to the big man back by the trees. It was a fearful look. Rawl turned and looked to the commander. Leave us, and please take my guards with you. I wish not to be disturbed. Demon bowed his head and left, the guards following. Dark and Rawl turned back, regarding the boy, then lowered himself to sit on the grass. He rearranged his robes once on the ground and smiled again at the boy. Better? The boy nodded. His lip still quivered. Are you afraid of that big man? The boy nodded. Did he hurt you? Did he touch you where he shouldn't? The boy shook his head. His eyes, reflecting a mix of fear and anger, stayed locked on Rawl. An ant crawled from the white sand onto his neck. What is your name? Rawl asked again. The boy did not answer. The master watched his brown eyes closely. Do you know who I am? Dark and Rawl, the boy answered in a weak voice. Rawl smiled indulgently. Father Rawl, he corrected. The boy stared at him. I want to go home. The ant inspected its way across his chin. Of course you do, Rawl said with a tone of sympathy and concern. Please believe me, I'm not going to harm you. You are simply here to help me with an important ceremony. You are an honored guest, meant to represent the innocence and strength of youth. You were selected because people told me what a fine boy you are. What a very good boy you are. Everyone has spoken highly of you. They tell me you are smart and strong. Do they speak the truth? The boy hesitated, his shy eyes looking away. Well, I guess they do. He looked back to Rawl. But I miss my mother, and I want to go home. The ant went in a circle around his cheek. Dark and Rawl stared off wistfully and nodded. I understand. I miss my mother also. She was such a wonderful woman, and I loved her so. She took good care of me. When I would do a chore that pleased her, she would make me a special supper, whatever I wanted. The boy's eyes got bigger. My mother does that too. My father, mother, and I had wonderful times together. We all loved each other very much and had fun together. My mother had a merry laugh. When my father would tell a boastful story, she would poke fun at him, and the three of us would laugh, sometimes until we got tears in our eyes. The boy's eyes brightened. He smiled a little. Why do you miss her? Is she gone away? No, Rawl sighed. She and my father died a few years ago. They were both old. They both had a good life together, but I still miss them. So I understand how you miss your parents. The boy nodded a little. His lip had stopped quivering. The ant walked up the bridge of his nose. He scrunched up his face, trying to get it off. Let's just try to have as good a time as we can for now, and you will be back with them before you know it. The boy nodded again. My name is Carl. Rawl smiled. Honored to meet you, Carl. He reached out and carefully picked the ant off the boy's face. Thanks, Carl said with relief. That's what I'm here for, Carl. To be your friend and help you in any way I can. If you're my friend, then dig me up and let me go home. His eyes glistened wetly. Soon enough, my son, soon enough. I wish I could right now, but the people expect me to protect them from evil people who would kill them. So I must do what I can to help. You are going to be a part of that help. You are going to be an important part of the ceremony that will save your mother and father from the evil ones who would kill them. You do want to protect your mother from harm, don't you? The torches flickered and hissed as Carl thought. Well, yes, but I want to go home. His lip began quivering again. Dark and Rawl reached out and stroked the boy's hair reassuringly, combing it back with his fingers, then smoothing it down. I know, but try to be brave. I won't let anyone harm you. I promise. I will guard you and keep you safe. He gave Carl a warm smile. Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat? Carl shook his head. All right, then. It is late. I will leave you to rest. He stood, straightening his robes, brushing off grass. Father Rawl? Rawl stopped and looked back down. Yes, Carl? A tear rolled down Carl's cheek. I'm afraid to be here alone. Could you stay with me? The master regarded the boy with a comforting expression. Why, of course, my son. Father Rawl lowered himself back down to the grass. For as long as you want, even all night if you want me.
I think we will go ahead and stop for now. We will pick up here again next Wednesday. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I love this series of books and look forward to meeting up with you all here each week. I hope you all have a very beautiful and amazing week. Love you bunches. Shalom.